It's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. It's like, yes, right, exactly. So what do you do about that? Well, I thought about that for a long time too. It's like, well, you don't get together in a damn mob, because all that does is allow you to be as horrible as you could possibly imagine and suffer from none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. So how about we don't do that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. You know, I read a lot about the terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it. It's so awful. So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You know, you too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way, and lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like, act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together for Christ's sake, so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could like polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then your eyes will be a little more open, then you can shine yourself up a little bit more, and then maybe you could bring your family together instead of having them be the hateful, spiteful, neurotic, infighting batch that you're like doomed to spend Christmas with. So then you fix yourself up a little bit, and then you got to figure out, well, can you figure out how to make peace with your idiot brother? And probably not, because he's just as dumb as you, so how the hell are you going to manage that? And so then maybe you get somewhere that way, and your family's sort of functioning, and you find out, well, that kind of relieved a little bit of suffering, although it reduced the opportunities for spiteful revenge, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. And so then you get your family together a little bit, and you're a little clued in then, at least a bit, because you've done something difficult that's actually difficult. You're a little wiser, and so then maybe you could put a tentative finger out beyond the family and try to change some little thing without wrecking it. So, and that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, you know, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing, and then you don't have any responsibility, because who the hell cares? And you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be. And you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? And you'll find very rapidly that it isn't the majority of your soul that's pursuing the whole meaning thing, because, well, look what you have to do that. You have to take on the fact that life is suffering. You have to put yourself together in the face of that. Well, that's hard. Christ, it's amazing people can even do it. I'm stunned every day when I go outside and it isn't a riot with everything burning. There's all these ruined people out there. They've got problems like you can't believe. Off they go to work and do things they don't even like, and look, the lights are on. It's a miracle. And we're so ungrateful. College students, the postmodern types, they're so ungrateful. You know, they don't know that they're surrounded by just a bloody miracle. It's a miracle that all this stuff works. That all you crazy chimpanzees that don't know each other can sit in the same room for 2 hours sweltering away without tearing each other apart, because that's what chimps do. Anyways, so I got to the bottom of some things, at least as far as I can tell, so I told you what the bottom is, and then I got this idea about what you might do about it, which isn't my idea. It's an old idea. It's far older than Christianity. It's old. It's the oldest story of mankind. Get yourself together. Transcend your suffering. See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less. Well, that's the way forward, as far as I can tell, if there is any way forward.
Thoughts on the Eastern idea of moving away from excessive thinking into the awareness beyond thinking, removing it from the driver's seat to be used more as a tool. Yeah, well, I thought a lot about this in relationship to a couple of ancient ideas. The one Mesopotamian idea, characterization of Marduk, who was the highest Mesopotamian deity. It was Marduk who carved up the goddess of chaos, Tiamat, into pieces and made the world out of her pieces. So Marduk is the force that confronts chaos and builds habitable order, like the Logos in Genesis. And one of Marduk's attributes was that he had eyes all the way around his head. Then there's Horus, the Egyptian god, who's the famous eye. And Horus is really a deification of attention, I would say. And there's a difference between attention and thinking. Like, let me give you an example. So thinking seems to be instrumental, mostly. People also often say to me, well, what's your strategy when you go into an interview? And the answer is, well, I don't have a strategy when I go into an interview, because I'm there to have a conversation. And I'm not sure where the conversation will go, and I'm willing to let it go wherever it goes. I'm not there to sell books, although I'm perfectly happy if more books sell, because obviously I wrote a book and I want people to read it, and there's a whole enterprise behind it, and so it's also my responsibility to do the marketing properly. But I'm not going to do these interviews to sell books or to promote myself, or I don't have a strategic goal in mind, except that I'm going to have a conversation and I'm going to say what I think and take the consequences, because I assume that if I say something and I believe it's true, then the consequences are as positive as they can be, regardless of how they look at the time. And that's an issue of faith, because I believe that the habitable order is generated by spoken truth. I believe that. I think that's the truest thing I know. And so I go into the interview, and I did this in my clinical practice, and I try to do this when I'm talking to people too, is that I'm not thinking about where the conversation is going or what point I want to make or what I want the outcome to be. Any of that, I just let that go. You know, it's within this broader framework of assuming that the truth is the most effective means of progressing. And then I pay attention. And what happens when you pay attention is that while you're watching a person, this is a great treatment for social anxiety, by the way, because if you're socially anxious, you tend not to pay attention to the person. Pay attention to who you're talking to. Watch them like a hawk, like not paranoid or anything like that, and not too intently because you make them uncomfortable, but intently. Pay attention to what they're saying, to how they look, to their facial gestures, all of that. Look at their face and watch and listen and try to understand what they're saying. And what you'll see is that, well, questions pop into your minds like, well, I didn't understand what you said. Can you clarify that? And sounds like you mean this. Is this what you mean? But not in a, I'll put you on the spot because I think you're wrong sort of way, but in a clarification sort of way. And all of that's attention. And so when I'm doing clinical work with people, and this is the reason I quit, by the way, about a year ago, is because I was starting to get distracted. I had a rule, which was, you have an hour with me and I do nothing but pay attention to you. I'm not thinking about what I want to accomplish. I'm not thinking about the problems in my life. I'm not distracted. And I listen to you and I ask questions when I don't understand. And if a thought occurs to me while I'm paying attention to you, then I'll tell you what I'm thinking strategically. I'm listening, thoughts emerge and I say them. I'm not putting spin on things. I'm not trying to manipulate the conversation in any particular way. And again, the reason for that is because I decided a long time ago, probably 30 years, that there was no more effective way of dealing with a complex situation than to try to say what you believe to be true and not to manipulate it. None of that, because those are all lies as far as I'm concerned, that kind of manipulation and spin.
So I say, well, everyone's not creative, and everybody goes, oh, that's terrible. It's like, it's not so terrible. It's not self-evident that you would curse someone with high levels of creativity. You know, you hear very frequently people say things like everyone's creative. It's like, that's wrong, okay? It's wrong. It's just as wrong as saying that everyone's extroverted. First of all, you have to be pretty damn smart to be creative, because otherwise you're just going to get to where other people have already got, and that's not creative by definition. So being fast and being out there at the front of things really makes a difference. And then you also have to have these divergent thinking capabilities, and that's part of your trait structure. And creative people are really different than non-creative people, you know, partly because, for example, they're highly motivated to do creative things and to experience novelty and to chase down aesthetic experiences and to attend movies and to read fiction and to go to museums and to enjoy poetry and to enjoy music that's not conventional music, for example. These aren't trivial differences. And so it's a real misstatement to make the proposition that everyone's creative. It's just simply not the case. It's a matter of wishful thinking. It's like saying that everyone's intelligent. Well, if everyone's intelligent, then the term loses all of its meaning, because any term that you can apply to every member of a category has absolutely no meaning. Now, and you know, the other thing you want to be thinking about here is that don't be thinking that creativity is such a good thing. It's a high-risk, high-return strategy. So if you're creative, you just try this. There's creative people in this room, man. You guys are going to have a hell of a time monetizing your creativity. It's virtually impossible. It's really, really difficult because, first of all, let's say you make an original product. You think the world will beat a pathway to your door if you build a better mousetrap. It's like, that's complete rubbish. It isn't true in the least. If you make a good creative product, you've probably solved about 5% of your problem. Because then you have marketing, which is insanely difficult, and then you have sales, and then you have customer support, and then you have to build an organization. And if it's really novel, you have to tell people what the hell the thing is. No one knows what that is, and that's a real problem. If you write a book, well, then you have the problem that another million people have also written a book. But if you produce something that's completely new and doesn't have a category, people can't search for it online. How are they going to find it? And then you have pricing problems, and it's really unbelievably difficult to produce something creative and then monetize it. And even worse, if you're the creative person, let's say you have a spectacular invention, you've got no money, right? You've got no customers. Those are big problems. And so maybe you go and you find a venture capitalist. We start with family and friends because that's how it works. You raise money for your product. You raise money from your family and friends. That's assuming you have family and friends that have some money and that they're going to give it to you. And most people aren't in that situation. So it's a terrible barrier right off the bat. And then, of course, you're putting your family and friends at substantial financial risk because the probability that your stupid idea is going to make money is virtually zero, even if it's a really brilliant idea. And so then let's say, well, you get past family and friends and you get venture capitalists involved, because that's often the next step. There's steps in building a business. Family and friends, angel investor, that's some rich guy that you've happened to meet, some man or some way who's into this sort of thing and is willing to provide you with some money to get your product off the ground. Well, how much of your product is that person going to take? Well, most of it. Most of it. And no wonder, because, you know, you don't have any money. How are you going to bargain for control over your product? He'll just say, well, do you want the money or not? And if your answer is no, then he'll go and do something else with his money. It's not like there's no shortage of things that you can do with your money. There's a million things you can do with it. So you're not in a great bargaining position. And then if you get venture capitalists involved, they'll take another big chunk, and maybe if they're not very straight with you, they'll just throw you out. Because maybe by that point in the company's development, you're nothing but a pain in the neck, because what do you know about marketing and sales and customer service and building an organization and running a business? Like, you don't have a clue, so why do they need you? So even if you're successful at generating a new idea and you put it into a business, the probability that you, as the originator of the idea, are going to make some money from it is very, very low. So don't be thinking that creativity is something you would want to curse yourself with. Now, you know, it's not all bad, because it opens up avenues of experience for creative people that aren't available to people who aren't creative. But it definitely is a high-risk, high-return strategy.
So the overwhelming probability is that you will fail. But a small proportion of creative people succeed spectacularly. And so it's like a lottery in some sense. You're probably going to lose. But if you don't lose, you could win big. And that keeps a lot of creative people going. But also they don't really have much choice in it, because if you're a creative person, you're like a fruit tree that's bearing fruit. You can suppress it, but it's very bad for you. The creative people I've worked with is if they're not creative, they're miserable, so they have to do it. There's real joy and pleasure in it and psychological utility, but it's certainly not a conservative strategy for moving forward through life. And whenever I talk to people who are creative, and you guys should listen to this because I know what I'm talking about. If you happen to be creative, if you're a songwriter or another kind of musician or an artist or any of the other number of things that you might be, find a way to make money and then practice your craft on the side, because you will starve to death otherwise. Now, for some of you that won't be true, but it's a tiny minority. Your best bet is to find a job that will keep body and soul together and parse off some time that you can pursue your creative thing, because then, as a long-term strategy, a medium to long-term strategy, it's a better one. But it's got incredibly difficult for people, musicians, for example, it's incredibly difficult for new musicians to monetize their craft, even if they're really, really good at it.
It'll decline rapidly, but 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion, and so it really doesn't matter.
So, do you have any practical advice on how I can improve my ability to concentrate and pay attention to the world around me? Often the devil's in the details, but some practical advice is, regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, or perhaps earlier, or perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that because your circadian rhythms operate more fluidly and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain, and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And because it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete the sugar in your blood. And then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so regulating your sleep and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. The other thing I would say is that spending some time scheduling your time is also extraordinarily useful. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to use schedules effectively. So the first thing I would say is that you should develop a long-term plan. You have to set up your vision, like Geppetto when he's looking at the star before Pinocchio's transformation takes place. You have to set up your long-term vision. You have some vision of the good towards which you're working, and some vision perhaps of the hell that you're avoiding. And then I would say once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. Many people say, I hate using a schedule, or I hate using a calendar. And what I would say about that is that if you hate using a schedule or a calendar, then you're probably using it wrong. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with, we'll say, arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. Okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest. And so I would also say that the trajectory that you're on is more important than your starting point. And that's also an extraordinarily optimistic observation, because it means that direction is more important than current position. And I mean, current position matters, obviously, but I don't think it does matter as much as direction. So if you want to learn to concentrate more, define what constitutes concentration, break it into micro habits, and then start practicing instantiation of those micro habits.
You know, it's not obvious to me that people themselves think that they're valuable all the time. Often they don't think that at all. They certainly don't think that often when they're depressed. They certainly don't think that when they're suicidal. They don't really think that when they're ashamed or guilty or frustrated or disappointed or angry or waking up at 3 a.m. and tormenting themselves with their consciences. They don't necessarily think that when they're fighting with their family or when they're upset at work or, you know, when things go wrong in life. And so it's not so bloody obvious that people are inherently valuable. And then you might also notice that it's kind of easy to think that some people are more valuable than others. It's very easy for human beings to think that about other human beings, because no matter where you look in human societies, there are rank orders of value, right? In any hierarchy that we produce that's associated with some ability, we find that some people are so much better at whatever it is that they're doing that it's an absolute miracle, and most people are absolutely dreadful at it. And so, you know, if you were thinking about inherent value as an approximation of skill or competence, then it wouldn't be obvious from the structure of the world that people were inherently valuable in that manner either, because there's such a rank order difference in our ability to do things. You know, and you might say, well, that kind of averages out across things, but I don't think that's a very strong argument either. So it's not obvious where this idea that people are inherently valuable came from. That's a tough one. In fact, I think it's one of the least obvious concepts that human beings have ever come up with, that each of us is to be attributed some divine spark, let's say, that makes us equal in some fundamental way before God, you know, before the reality of the universe itself, even in relationship to our own laws. I mean, if you want a miracle for an idea, I can't think of one that's more unlikely than that. So I've been puzzling over that for a very long time, because I cannot understand how in the world we ever agreed to act as if it was true. It's really something. It's a remarkable, fundamental idea. And what's so interesting about it too is that once you have that idea, weird as it is and improbable as it is, and you start to organize your social relationships in accordance with it, well, then they work. My rule too is treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping, and it's sort of predicated on the idea that regardless of your inadequacies and your malevolence, which, you know, I'm sure you have many inadequacies and no shortage of malevolence, just like everyone else. Regardless of that, you have a moral obligation, so that would be a responsibility, to assume that despite all evidence, that there's actually something of intrinsic worth about you, and that as a consequence, you're duty bound to treat yourself like that is true. And then it turns out that if you do that, well, then your life gets better.
And I don't mean happier exactly, although I would say it gets happier. I mean it gets richer and more meaningful and deeper and more worthwhile, and you become more educated and you become wiser and you treat yourself with more respect, and you're a better model for other people, and you're a better father or a better sister or better mother, whatever it happens to be. And you're less ridden by that guilt that gnaws at you and shame that's there otherwise saying, you're not what you could be, you're not what you could be. And that's a hell of a voice to get rid of, and it's certainly not one that's easy to ignore. So that's a pretty good idea that there's something divine, let's say, that resides within you of ultimate worth, even as a philosophical statement or a psychological statement rather than a metaphysical statement. It seems to be a precondition for establishing properly harmonious relationships with yourself. And that's worth thinking about a lot. Because you could think that in some sense you just own yourself, you know? Because people do kind of make that claim, especially when they're trying to justify, for example, their right to suicide. That, you know, it's your life, it's your body, you're yours to do what you will with. And if that was true, well then it would seem to me that life would be a lot more straightforward, because you would just tell yourself things that you would instantly obey and believe. So first of all, you'd tell yourself all the things that you were going to do, and then you just run off and do them, which you don't, obviously, because it's much more difficult than that. And then you'd also say, well, enough of the guilt and the shame and the negative emotion and the disillusionment and the vengefulness and all those things that make life hard. The self-recrimination, it's like, what the hell do we need that for? And if we're our masters of our own destiny and owners of our own fate, then why can't we just command to ourselves that be dispensed with? And like, that doesn't work. I've never seen anybody able to do that. I mean, you can fool yourself for very brief periods of time into thinking that that might work, but it doesn't work, and that's strange. And this is one of the reasons I love the psychoanalysts, because they were really the people, apart from the religious types, who figured out that whatever you are, you're not a unitary spirit that's under your own dominion. You know, you're something like a loose unity of a multiplicity of spirits, many of which are doing their own thing, which you're striving to bring into some form of unity. But even that unity isn't something that's under your control in any real sense. It's a unity that has its own nature that you have to exist in relationship to. You know, it's like, it's not obvious to me that people themselves think that they're valuable all the time. Often they don't think that at all. They certainly don't think that often when they're depressed. They certainly don't think that when they're suicidal. They don't really think that when they're ashamed or guilty or frustrated or disappointed or angry or waking up at 3 in the morning and tormenting themselves with their consciences. They don't necessarily think that when they're fighting with their family or when they're upset at work or, you know, when things go wrong in life. And so it's not so bloody obvious that people are inherently valuable. And then you might also notice that it's kind of easy to think that some people are more valuable than others. It's very easy for human beings to think that about other human beings, because no matter where you look in human societies, there are rank orders of value, right? In any hierarchy that we produce that's associated with some ability, we find that some people are so much better at whatever it is that they're doing that it's an absolute miracle, and most people are absolutely dreadful at it. And so, you know, if you were thinking about inherent value as an approximation of skill or competence, then it wouldn't be obvious from the structure of the world that people were inherently valuable in that manner either, because there's such a rank order difference in our ability to do things. You know, and you might say, well, that kind of averages out across things, but I don't think that's a very strong argument either. So it's not obvious where this idea that people are inherently valuable came from. That's a tough one. In fact, I think it's one of the least obvious concepts that human beings have ever come up with, that each of us is to be attributed some divine spark, let's say, that makes us equal in some fundamental way before God, you know, before the reality of the universe itself, even in relationship to our own laws. I mean, if you want a miracle for an idea, I can't think of one that's more unlikely than that. So I've been puzzling over that for a very long time, because I cannot understand how in the world we ever agreed to act as if it was true. It's really something. It's a remarkable, fundamental idea. And what's so interesting about it too is that once you have that idea, weird as it is and improbable as it is, and you start to organize your social relationships in accordance with it, well, then they work. My rule too is treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping, and it's sort of predicated on the idea that regardless of your inadequacies and your malevolence, which, you know, I'm sure you have many inadequacies and no shortage of malevolence, just like everyone else. Regardless of that, you have a moral obligation, so that would be a responsibility, to assume that despite all evidence, that there's actually something of intrinsic worth about you, and that as a consequence, you're duty-bound to treat yourself like that is true. And then it turns out that if you do that, well, then your life gets better. And I don't mean happier exactly, although I would say it gets happier. I mean it gets richer and more meaningful and deeper and more worthwhile, and you become more educated and you become wiser and you treat yourself with more respect, and you're a better model for other people, and you're a better father or a better sister or better mother, whatever it happens to be. And you're less ridden by that guilt that gnaws at you and shame that's there otherwise saying, you're not what you could be, you're not what you could be. And that's a hell of a voice to get rid of, and it's certainly not one that's easy to ignore. So that's a pretty good idea that there's something divine, let's say, that resides within you of ultimate worth. Even as a philosophical statement or a psychological statement rather than a metaphysical statement, it seems to be a precondition for establishing properly harmonious relationships with yourself. And that's worth thinking about a lot. Because you could think that in some sense you just own yourself, you know? Because people do kind of make that claim, especially when they're trying to justify, for example, their right to suicide, that, you know, it's your life, it's your body, you're yours to do what you will with. And if that was true, well, then it would seem to me that life would be a lot more straightforward, because you would just tell yourself things that you would instantly obey and believe. So first of all, you'd tell yourself all the things that you were going to do, and then you just run off and do them, which you don't, obviously, because it's much more difficult than that. And then you'd also say, well, enough of the guilt and the shame and the negative emotion and the disillusionment and the vengefulness and all those things that make life hard. The self-recrimination, it's like, what the hell do we need that for? And if we're our masters of our own destiny and owners of our own fate, then why can't we just command to ourselves that be dispensed with? And like, that doesn't work. I've never seen anybody able to do that. I mean, you can fool yourself for very brief periods of time into thinking that that might work, but it doesn't work, and that's strange. And this is one of the reasons I love the psychoanalysts, because they were really the people, apart from the religious types, who figured out that whatever you are, you're not a unitary spirit that's under your own dominion. You know, you're something like a loose unity of a multiplicity of spirits, many of which are doing their own thing, which you're striving to bring into some form of unity. But even that unity isn't something that's under your control in any real sense. It's a unity that has its own nature that you have to exist in relationship to.
You're in chaos and you don't know what's going on, then you start imagining what might be going on. And that imagination is partly the world, as it might be, but it's also partly the structure of your unconscious mind, which is producing the fantasies. And so when you're truly in chaos, then the distinction between your fantasies and reality isn't clear. That's actually part of what constitutes the chaos. So imagine this. So you're in a relationship and the person betrays you, and you knew who they were, or at least you thought you did before that moment. But now you're looking at them and you don't know who they are, and you don't know what the past was, and you don't know what the present is, and you don't know what the future is going to be. All of that's been thrown up into the air in a major way. That's traumatic. So much has fallen apart that it's traumatic. So what do you start to do? You start to imagine what might be the situation. The reality is your imagination and the reality at the same time. They're not pulled apart at all. You cannot distinguish between them. So Pinocchio is in this situation that's half fantasy and half reality, in this chaotic state. And he has to go down to find the thing that he least wants to find. He's got this intuition that in facing that thing, that chaos that life really is, that chaos, that he's going to find his father and reunite with him. So you could also say that in some sense it's a decision of faith, I suppose, because you might ask yourself, well, why bother confronting chaos? If chaos is the ultimate reality, then what the hell use is there in facing it? Because it's just going to reveal itself as the ultimate reality and drown you. But the myths always say the same thing. They say, no, if you confront what's really disturbing you, if you really confront it, you do it voluntarily, you're going to find order in it eventually. Or at least that's the only way you're going to find order. Now, it's not like these stories are optimistic, and it's not as if they give you a sure guide to success. That's the other thing. It's not like they're unerringly accurate, because you can be subsumed by chaos that's so total that even if you face it, you're not going to prevail. I mean, that's why people die. That's one way of looking at it anyways. But the mythology basically says this is your best bet. If there's a process that's going to work, this is it. And then you might think, well, the better you do it, the better the chances are of success, or the more consistently you do it, the better the chances of success are. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. So anyways, Pinocchio's down at the bottom of the ocean, and every time he says he's trying to find out where Monstro is, and they ask questions to the fish that are down there, but every time they mention Monstro's name, all the fish disappear. It's like Voldemort, right? He's the guy whose name you cannot say. And Monstro is precisely that. It's the thing that frightens everyone. And so asking questions down there isn't helping very much. And so Pinocchio, what he does is he's calling for his father, and he keeps going deeper and deeper into the depths. And there's a scene where the darkness of the ocean turns into an even more profound darkness, and that's what Pinocchio disappears into. And then we see Monstro. He's in this sort of foggy representation, this huge thing that lies very much at the bottom. And there's no life or anything around him except, I think these are mackerel, but there's no life down there. He's so far down at the bottom of the ocean that there's nothing that's alive down there. And then we go inside the whale, which is of course absurd, and we see that the whale has eaten a boat at some point in the past. This is one whopping whale. And Geppetto is sitting with the kitten, of all things. He's also got that little goldfish bowl full of goldfish with him too, which is quite the feat. Anyways, he's sitting there and he knows that he's trapped in the belly of the whale too, and that he can't get out. And so that's an interesting issue. It's because not only is Pinocchio lacking his father, which isn't a good thing, but the father is lacking the son. And there's some indication that the father can't get out of the whale without the son. And so it's like the possibility for order is down there in this chaotic state, but unless there's an active agent to go seek it out, it's not animated enough to get out by itself. You know, and you could say, well, there's wisdom in the libraries, but without you going in there and gathering it and embodying it, all it does is sit there in potential, in all of that implicit form. That's a good way of thinking about it. So anyways, Geppetto is pretty hopeless because he can't figure out any way of getting out of the whale, and he's also starving. He's starving in the belly of the whale. And here's a way of thinking about that. Geppetto's a good guy, but he's old. And that means his way of doing things is no longer fruitful. That's why he's starving. And it's especially not fruitful because he's missing his son. He's missing the active element that the child represents, say the playful and transformative element that the child represents. And so if you get stuck doing something the same old way, at some point it's no longer going to work. Even if it was good at some point, it has to be updated. And it's updated by, let's call it the spirit of youth, or the spirit of attention, or the spirit of play, something like that. The willingness to break boundaries and take risks. And Geppetto is very, very skilled, but he doesn't have that. And that's symbolized by the loss of his son. That's why he was out looking for his son too. He needs him. And so they're in despair down there, trying to fish and not getting anything. And so Monstro wakes up and he opens his mouth and a bunch of water starts to come in. And then you see Pinocchio with the fish. Now, you may remember, and perhaps you don't know, that one of the symbols for Christ is a fish, ichthys, right? And that's a play on the Greek representation of Christ's name. But there's more to it than that, because all of Christ's followers are fishermen. And he performs a bunch of miracles with fish. And fish are strange things because, well, you can pull them up out of the depths. That's part of it. And so they're things that can be pulled out of the depth. And you could say that it's going to be very difficult for me to take this apart, but you could say in some sense that Christ is a meta-fish. A fish is something that you can dine on, but a way of being is something that provides you with something to dine on a continual basis. And so you might say, well, is it better to have a fish or to be a fisherman? That's another way of thinking about it. And obviously it's better to be a fisherman because then you can get more fish. And so it's one thing to have something, but it's another thing completely to know how to generate good things. And so if you had any sense, you'd take the latter over the former, even though the former is more instantaneously gratifying and requires less work and responsibility. And so anyways, the whale opens his mouth and goes chasing these fish. And Pinocchio he's trying to get the hell out of there, even though he wants to find the whale. When he actually sees the whale, he leaves. And that's also a very common mythological plot element. It's very frequently that what happens when the hero first sees the terrible thing, the dragon say, the terrible thing that he's come to conquer, he like freezes and gets the hell out of there because it's far worse than he thought it was going to be. And so Pinocchio, it's like, no way, man. I'm not going near that whale. Away he swims, and he's actually at the forefront of all the fish, which is quite interesting too. So, in the meantime, Monstro has opened his mouth and the fish are pouring in, and Geppetto is fishing like mad, and he's catching fish like crazy. And so, they have a problem. The problem is how to get out of the whale. That's the actual problem. But a nested problem inside that is how not to starve to death. And so Geppetto is pretty happy that even though he's not getting out of the whale, that he gets to have something to eat. So you could say as well that he's not exactly focused on the right thing. He's focused on the micro problem instead of the macro problem. And that makes him kind of blind. So anyways, the whale swallows up Pinocchio, and Geppetto keeps fishing. And then he snags Pinocchio. Now this is cool because, and this is another example of that meta fish idea. It's like, Geppetto's actually looking not for a fish, he's looking for a way out of the damn whale. And then he catches a bunch of fish and he's like focused on that like mad. And then he catches Pinocchio. And Pinocchio represents what would get him out of the whale, but he's so bloody obsessed with the fish that he doesn't even notice. So he catches Pinocchio and flings him into the fish basket. And so it signifies the blindness of Geppetto's orientation when he's inside the whale. And that's kind of a comment on his aged and insufficient nature. He's solving the problem very well, but it's the wrong problem. So anyways, he fires Pinocchio into the fish bin. Pinocchio says, "Father, I'm here." And Geppetto says, "Don't bother me right now, Pinocchio. I'm busy fishing." Well, then that's fine. So then he kind of wakes up. He has this little moment of insight, this little revelation that, well, he's caught Pinocchio, so who cares about the damn fish? So then he runs over to the fish box to grab Pinocchio, and instead he grabs a fish and gives it a kiss. And so that it's another way of hammering home the fact that there's this confusion that he's suffering from. He can't distinguish the local truth from the transcendent truth. And so anyways, he does figure it out. He tosses the fish aside and he grabs Pinocchio, and they're all thrilled to death to see each other, and so they're united. So Pinocchio has found his father, but they're still trapped in the belly of the whale. Now, Pinocchio, he gets covered with a blanket, he takes off his hat, and he reveals his jackass ears. And so he's found his father, but he's damaged and not, Pinocchio, he's damaged and not in good shape. He isn't becoming what he was supposed to be. In fact, he's actually degenerated since Geppetto saw him last. And so he becomes embarrassed. He says, "That's nothing, I have a tail too," and then he spins that around kind of laughing, and he brays and gets really embarrassed. And so that's what you see here. He looks like, well, he's revealed himself as a jackass to his father. But you know, that's actually a good thing because he is a jackass. And if he was unwilling to admit his insufficiency, he wouldn't have ever gone on this pursuit. So it's this perverse willingness to note that he isn't all that he could be that's part of what drives him to find everything that his father represents. It's a humility, and it's an admission of insufficiency. And you need that before you're going to learn anything, because before you learn anything, you have to admit that there are things that are important that you don't know, and that you're a fool, and maybe that you're a braying jackass. And so that's why there are injunctions in many religious writings that portray humility positively as the antidote to arrogance. That's the right way of thinking about it, is that humility means I still have something to learn. The question to some degree is, how do you help someone that's lost?
And the answer to that is, if they aren't willing to not be lost, you cannot help them. And I would also say that as a clinician. You see, it's a statement that's informed, I would say, by my mythological knowledge, but also by straight clinical wisdom, not mine particularly. I mean, one of the things that Carl Rogers pointed out was that there were necessary preconditions for entering into a therapeutic relationship. And that would be really any relationship where the mutual flourishing of the two people involved was the paramount goal. And one of the preconditions was that both people had to want that to happen. And Rogers believed he didn't know how to get the horse to drink once you had brought it to the water. And I've thought about that a lot, because when people are really lost, sometimes they're so lost that they can't be found. And I think the only thing that you can do in a situation like that is get your life together and manifest the reality of an alternative mode of being. That's what you've got. And so that's the only way I know of to solve an intractable problem. There's a statement in the New Testament that's really vicious. In fact, there's a number of them, but this is a particularly vicious one. And that is, don't cast pearls before swine. And what that means is, if you're trying to help and it doesn't work, then stop helping. It's not helping, right? It may be just wasting your time. It might be making things worse. You know, if you're offering something and it's not taken, then perhaps you should be offering it somewhere else. And sometimes, if you offer a hand and the person won't take it, you have to stop offering the hand. And then what you do is you go off and you have your life. And sometimes that means in people's lives, for example, that they have to leave their family members behind. There's a scene in the New Testament, this is another very harsh scene, where Christ is walking down the road with his disciples. I hope I've got this story right, but I've got it essentially right. And his mother calls to him and says, I believe that he's supposed to come back to the home because his uncle has died and that there's going to be a funeral. And he turns to his mother and says something like, let the dead bury their dead. I'm about my Father's business. It's something like that. And you read that and you think, that should have been edited out. No, but it shouldn't have been edited out, because it's exactly right, because sometimes the thing you do is walk away because there's no other solution. And if you are trapped in pathological relationships and you see no way out of them, if someone who is sinking has their hands around your neck and is pulling you down, you're not obligated to drown with them. You know, there's a rule too, if you're a lifeguard. Some of you have had lifeguard training. How do you approach someone who's drowning and panicking in the water? Feet out, right, like this. It's like, I'll save you, but that doesn't mean you get to drown me while I'm doing it. And if it's you drown or both of us drown, it's you drown. And that's wisdom. That's not... I've talked to lots of business people about leadership, and there's a literature on leadership, but it's not a good literature. It's pretty shallow. Partly because it's not that easy to define leadership, and partly because there are different... You know, people have different temperaments, and different temperaments can be leaders. They just do it in different ways. Now, there's something in common about being a leader, though, and I would say one is that if you're an actual leader, you actually know where you're going, right? Because what are you going to do? Lead people in circles? It's like, maybe they'll follow you, but you're not a leader, you're just a charlatan. So you have to know where you're going. And then you have to be able to communicate that. And then people have to trust you, so you actually have to be honest, because people aren't that stupid, at least not for a long period of time. And then where you're going has to have some value, because otherwise, why would anyone want to go along with you? And then you might say, well, what are the attributes then that make you a leader? And I would say, well, they're characterological, fundamentally. And this is not naive optimism or casual moralizing. It has nothing to do with that. You know, we know, for example, that conscientiousness, the personality trait, is a good predictor of long-term success in most occupations, not all, but most, and that one of the things that's associated with conscientiousness is that people keep their word, they're trustworthy. And that's certainly one element of a leader, especially across any reasonable amount of time. You have to be able to trust the person. They can even be harsh, right? It doesn't matter, because you can see harsh leaders and kind leaders. But as long as they do what they say they will do, then you can follow them and you know that the future payoff is secure, something like that. So the idea that characterological development is more important to leadership than being a firstborn, that's a very crucial psychological realization, that it's characterological development that makes you favored of God. You know, and I do think we've forgotten this in many ways, because
there isn't a lot of emphasis in our education system on characterological development. And that's very, very surprising to me. I think maybe it's partly because in our fractured society, we can't agree on what constitutes a reasonable characterological goal. So we just throw up our hands and don't educate our kids to any degree at all, especially in schools, about what an admirable person is like, or even let them know that, well, maybe you should actually try to be one, you know, that's actually the most important possible thing that you could learn, right? So, and I also think, and I think this is laid out very thoroughly in the biblical stories as well, is that if there are enough people who are admirable, then things work. And if there aren't, then things are terrible. You get wiped out. You remember when Abraham is bargaining with God with regards to Sodom and Gomorrah, he asks God to save the city if there's like 40 admirable people, right? Respectable. But let's say admirable, right? I don't want to say good, because good is being corrupted in some sense by casual usage. I mean admirable, noble people, right? I think Abraham bargains God down to like 10. If there's 10 of them in the city won't be destroyed. And that's not very many in a city. So there's an interesting idea there, which is that there doesn't have to be that many people in a group who have their act together. But 0 is the wrong number. And if it's 0, then we're seriously in trouble. And I think that goes along with the idea of the Pareto principle in economics too, which is that it's a small minority of people who do most of the productive work in any given domain. So a small number of properly behaving people might have enough of an impact to keep everything moving, and that might actually be true, but it can't fall below some crucial level. And I do think that we're in some danger of allowing it to fall below some crucial level, because our society seems to be at war in some ways against the idea of the individual and individual character per se. And I think that's absolutely catastrophic. That's part of the reason that I'm doing these biblical lectures. I think that I've known for a long time that the moral presuppositions of a culture are instantiated in its stories. They're not instantiated in its explicit philosophy. There might be a layer of explicit philosophy, and of course there is in the West, and a layer of explicit law, but underneath that there are stories. And there isn't anything under the stories except maybe behavior. That's so implicit, it doesn't even actually count. It's not a cognitive operation. And so these are the stories that are underneath our culture. So there better be something to them. That's what we hope. But more importantly, maybe we shouldn't toss them away without knowing what they mean, because if we toss them away, then we are throwing everything that we depend on away, as far as I can tell, and we will pay for it. We'll pay for it individually because we'll be weak. You know, because if you're not firm in your convictions, then someone else who's firm in their convictions, you're their puppet, like instantly. And then you're also the puppet of your own doubts, right? Because unless you have convictions, you're going to generate doubts like mad, because everyone does. And then the doubts will win, and you'll be paralyzed. The hero story is another fundamental element of the clinical theories, I would say. It's predicated on the idea that you learn through voluntary contact with that frightens or disgusts you. And that's a hallmark of psychoanalytic theory. Carl Jung said his primary dictum was instir quellinus invenitur, which I'm sure I'm massacring because it's Latin, but it meant in filth it will be found. And one of the hallmarks of the clinical theories is that within the confines of everyone's experience, and you can think about this as experience out in the world or experience in the unconscious mind, there are dirty little secrets, let's say, and skeletons and dreadful old fears and remnants of abuse and memories of pathological behavior and failures of courage that leave you undeveloped, perhaps out of avoidance, and that the psychoanalytic process is precisely the careful encounter with those forgotten and repressed elements of the self, in the hope that a clear encounter will redeem them, unite them with the remainder of your personality.
and make you stronger in consequence. And I would say that that's just a variant of the manner in which human beings learn, and we'll talk about this more in relationship to Piaget, because you always learn when you're wrong, which is very annoying. Now, what do you learn when you're correct? You're walking in the world, you're operating in the world, you have a sense of what you want to have happen. You're always looking at the world through this sense of what you want to have happen. You're acting so that what you want to have happen will happen. And when it happens, well, then you're happy because, well, first of all, you get what you want, and that's good, maybe, depending on what you want. But it's also good because if you get what you want when you act, then it turns out that your model of how to act is valid, right? The outcome, that you get what you want, indicates no error on the part of your model. But it's very frequently the case that when you act to get what you want, you don't get what you want. And then that's unpleasant because you don't get what you want. But it's even more unpleasant because it brings with it the hint of a suggestion that the manner in which you're construing the world is incorrect at some indeterminate level. So, for example, if you tell a joke at a party, you presume that when they hear the joke, they will laugh. And then if you tell the joke and it goes flat, or even worse, disgusts and offends people, then you're going to be taken aback. And that's partly because you didn't get what you want, and that's not so good. But it's more because there's something wrong with the way you conceptualized the situation. And then you're faced with a problem, and the problem is the emergence of a domain of the unknown. It's like, well, what kind of mistake did you make? Maybe you're not as funny as you think you are. That could be a big problem. Maybe you're not around people who are the way you think they are. Maybe they don't like you as much as you thought they liked you. I mean, the potential for various paranoid thoughts of increasing severity to come welling up at you in a situation where you make even a trivial social mistake is quite broad. And when you make an error of that sort, you have to face it and sort through all the possibilities so that you can find out what it was that you did wrong and how to retool it so that in the future you don't make the same mistake. Well, that requires in some sense what you might describe as a journey into the belly of the beast being that place where things have fallen apart and where you're overwhelmed with negative emotion and chaos and confusion. And that's a very old story. That's the story of the journey to the underworld. And the hero is the person who makes the voluntary journey to the underworld to collect what's been languishing down there. And that's the basic motif of psychoanalytic theory. I would say it's the basic motif in some sense of clinical practice, because one of the things that you do as a clinician is find out what people are afraid of and what they're avoiding, and that can be in their past or in their present or in their future. Break it down into smaller pieces and help them devise strategies of approach and mastery